Recording in progress, ladies and gentlemen, episode number 54 of the Roses and Rhetoric podcast. Joining me again, special guest co-host, the no less charming, no less Joseph Matz. Joe, thank you for being here.
Yeah, happy to be here as always.
As promised to our viewers last week, we will open up this episode with a discussion on the conclusion of the Daniel Craig James Bond saga, No Time to Die. I saw it last week. Joe, I'm assuming you saw it either today or yesterday.
Yeah, I saw it yesterday evening. Yeah.
Yesterday evening. Let's start with your opinion as kind of the official voice of reason with all things film and cinema on this podcast. What did you think about the movie, and what were your thoughts when it was all over, when the Daniel Craig saga came to an end?
Yeah, obviously, if you have not seen it, let's just head it off with spoiler alerts here because I don't think you can really dig into this one too much without going into the spoilers at a certain point. So if you haven't seen it,
that's fair. Spoiler alerts will follow, and basically skip ahead. I will probably be talking about this for at least 10 or so minutes. So, kind of feel free to skip ahead if you have not yet seen it. So with that throat clearing, yes, let's get on with it.
I enjoyed it overall. I think for me, this film, I very clearly slots in as the number 3 of the 5 Bond films that Craig has done. I think it's very clearly better than 2 of them and very clearly worse than 2 of them. So it's very easy to judge it on that standpoint. And I think it also kind of showed the benefits and the negatives of the Craig Bonds really being serialized versus the past Bonds tend to be very loose. Like you'd have the same M or the same Q, but otherwise everything was switching up every Bond movie. There wasn't a lot of continuity. Where these ones have really stuck to there's an actual through line through these films. And so I think it benefited from that because, yeah, as we said, if you're still listening, you've been warned. Daniel Craig dies in this one. It's very clearly the final Daniel Craig Bond movie. And the fact that all these characters have a history with him does make those final moments have some real, you actually are moved to a degree in this one, which is not something I'm used to feeling in a Bond movie. But I think the downside was because more than any other Bond film, obviously it builds off the last one, and the last one wasn't very good. So, I didn't have quite the same connection to the Blofeld dying. It was just kind of all right, cool, he's dead, great. I just care about him. His whole relationship with Leah Seydoux' Madeline, sure, it was fine.
Right.
Adding a kid, gives it a little extra pathos at the end there, but I can't say I was super all in on that relationship.
No.
So that robs it of some of what it's going for there. I honestly, the stuff with all the people who he worked with kind of meant more to me.
Right.
What did you think, Jimmy? Obviously the action scenes I thought were, they're well filmed. Cary Joji Fukunaga is probably best known for filming the entirety of the first season of True Detective. And I think, he visually does a good job here, but I don't think it was the best Bond film from an action standpoint, story standpoint. But like I said, it was also not the worst of these 5. So
let me start by saying that I went into this movie fully committed to Daniel Craig as James Bond. I enjoyed him as James Bond. I much more so than I enjoyed Pierce Brosnan. I think the Daniel Craig Bond was a smarter Bond, was a more enjoyable film franchise than I felt from the kind of almost high sci-fi James Bond of previous genres.
Definitely.
Villains with diamonds blown into their faces, shooting space lasers down, evaporating entire, continents almost. I mean, it was Pierce Brosnan's James Bond at the end became a caricature, and to like such a high degree that it was almost like, what am I even watching anymore? Then we're introduced to Daniel Craig in Casino Royale, and it's immediately different. It's a gruffer James Bond. One is hesitant to use the words realistic when talking about James Bond.
It's definitely got some Jason Bourne DNA.
Yes. So I say that to say this. I thought No Time to Die was basically at best a mediocre movie. Like at best.
I enjoyed it for the most part, but this is not a movie where I'm like, oh, it's a must see. Like,
no.
If you enjoy the Bond movies, it's eventually a must see.
Right. Yes.
A year from now, when it's on Netflix or HBO or whatever.
Yes. Everybody will eventually see this movie, but eventually is the key word there. Let me start with some plot devices that I felt out of character for Daniel Craig's James Bond.
Okay.
Programmable nanobots that only kill people of a certain DNA. That felt more Pierce Brosnan to me than the previous Bond, than the previous Daniel Craig villains. I mean, this is, after all, the same James Bond that tongue in cheek is given a radio in Skyfall as kind of like the epitome of technological prowess, right? I mean, it was very much, like I said, a more realistic take on intelligence. The nanobot plot point felt out of character in that regard. The almost comical lack of development of the main villain. I mean,
no, I agree with that. Absolutely.
Can anybody actually summarize in one carefully worded sentence who this guy actually fucking is? Does anybody fucking? I mean, you kind of get a couple of expositions, but in the movie, you're like, wait, who the fuck was that guy again? Like,
and I was a little confused as to exactly why his motivations are what they are. Like,
whoa,
why is he?
But so even that. But remember, even there, we see Mallory comically again almost make fun of the movie itself of saying, what are his motivations? Oh, something about freedom. I mean, they essentially come out
and very vague.
Yeah, they essentially come out and just say, he's kind of a bad guy. Like, that's essentially what the movie tells you about the villain.
And of course, he has the classic, like, you and I are very similar.
Yeah,
it's just like, are you?
Well, right. First of all, they're not. Second of all, they already did that plot point in Spectre in a kind of a more believable way, and they kind of even touch on it a little bit in Skyfall with the main villain there, who kind of, in a way, is actually not even in a way, was himself a former MI6 agent as well.
Right.
So yeah, kind of these weird revival of themes that I felt they had already dealt with. For people who are wondering, Joe Matz was like the worst of 5 Daniel Craig Bond. He's only done 4. You're forgetting Quantum of Solace. Everybody else is also. I would say my favorite of the Daniel Craig Bond movies is by far Casino Royale. I mean, to me, that's the best one, I think.
I would have to revisit them to be certain of it, because I really think there is a very clear, like, 2-1-2 dynamic to this and quality. I remember liking Skyfall a little bit more than Casino Royale, but you can't go wrong with either of those. I think those are 2 of the best Bonds of all time, without question.
Yep.
And then, like you said, Quantum of Solace was pretty forgettable. And honestly, I probably should have rewatched Spectre just to make sure I wasn't missing stuff in this one. But I didn't really want to. About Spectre.
Basically, from what I gather, the reviews that I've read of No Time to Die more or less touch on the things we're talking about here. I mean, kind of poorly laid out plot points, forgettable villains, So yeah, and I was disappointed. I thought, if ever there was a need for a movie to speak highly of the importance of qualified individual in important institutions, it was now. And to see it so firmly fall on its face, really, to me, was an unfortunate turn of events. I mean, it was a letdown for me because, let's actually talk a little bit about the action scenes as well. I felt at several points in the movie there was bizarre choices of CGI and bizarre choices of cinematography. I remember a few scenes in the car that felt weird to me, and then some of the other chases at as well felt kind of bizarre. Maybe that was just me. I'm very finicky with poor uses of CGI, but all in all, go ahead.
Go ahead. Nothing like that really stood out to me. Like there were, at least I don't remember catching any like overt like visual failings of this movie. I'm just kind of confused as to, again, like what the villains are trying to accomplish at certain points. Like there's that whole chase in the car, and what is it, like the Norwegian countryside? I forget it where.
Yeah, you don't even know where you are.
But yeah, wherever Madeline's house was, and then they're chasing them in that car, and all these cars just like kind of like bump into them, and then he like trucks them over. And I was confused. I was like, are you trying to capture them, and that's why you're being so gentle here? But then later on, they're just shooting at everyone.
Right.
So it's like, if you just wanted to kill them, it seems like it was an easy solve. They had a helicopter, they had like 10 cars.
Right.
But so it's like they're fighting with their hands tied behind their back. And then at the very end of the movie, it's kind of vague on how many bad guys are in this facility. And then eventually it becomes clear that they're all dead except for what's his name? The main villain, Rami Malek's Safin.
See, you don't even know his name.
I don't even.
Proving how underdeveloped he is as a character. I didn't even know who he was.
Like, he doesn't really matter outside of like what he does for James Bond's personal life.
Right.
It's like he has some backstory with Madeline where like her dad killed his family, and so he killed her mom, and it's this whole thing. Which again would matter more if I was in on Spectre and I really cared about her character.
Right. The daughter of an assassin. Yeah, I mean, what was interesting too is that, so at the end, James Bond ends up being infected with the nanobots.
Right. Which you knew someone was going to get infected with the nanobots. Right. It was going to cause this sort of issue.
But it's kind of a consequenceless, or how it says, it almost is without consequence because he's already fatally wounded, and
probably.
And he has to stay behind to reactivate the doors to let the bombs fall into the facility. So it's like adding insult to injury almost, but it's like he still has to get blown to pieces in the end. So even though
I'm gonna defend that a little bit, just because I feel like your alternative is if he, like, let's say he's able to like close the door or open the doors, and then he's wounded and he's probably gonna die. But if he doesn't know for sure that like there's no point in me doing this,
he may make an effort. Is that what you're
right?
Gonna say?
And so he's making an effort versus having the like emotional phone calls. So I feel like that makes sense, trying to set that up towards the end there. And I do want to give some credit to like some fun bits where like during that bit, there's one time where he like turns this corner and it's like a circular kind of tunnel hallway. And right when he turns, he does the shot, which is like the classic like Bond opening song end of shot. So I like that they threw like things like that in there as like his swan song here. So I thought that was fun. So, I think that this movie has moments. Like I said, I think it's better than two of the other films in this franchise, or the Craig franchise.
Sure. I mean,
like,
again, it's better than a movie that no one even remembers. I mean, that's hard to say.
Like, if I was grading this overall, I would probably give it a B-, like maybe a C+.
Your grading criteria of B, I would give it a C at best. I would give it
at least a C+ for me. I think it has enough good action. It does like pull your heartstrings a little. Like, again, it pulled my heartstrings despite my lack of investment in one of the key relationships here.
Right.
So I feel like it earns some points for that. And also having, like, I almost think I'm grading on a slight curve because it has to overcome Spectre.
Or I just overcome, because even I think Spectre plays on Quantum of Solace a little bit from what I remember. So I mean, you really have to.
I honestly can't remember anything about either of those two movies.
In any event, like I said, despite this movie being kind of a letdown, still Daniel Craig is my favorite Bond that I've still probably still my favorite Bond. Certainly, I enjoy him more than Pierce Brosnan's character. But again, that's more to do with the type of movie that Pierce Brosnan's Bond played rather than the acting in either one of them. I enjoyed the Daniel Craig perspective more so than Pierce
Definitely.
Brosnan.
Well, I definitely liked the turn into like a semi-realistic Bond. And then one thing I wondered about that, were you as surprised as I was about the minimal Ana de Armas in this movie? Because I felt like in the previews and stuff, I was like, oh, she's gonna be a key person in this.
Right.
And she has like 15 minutes and then she's
yeah,
gone.
and
Which
you
I
know,
actually kind of liked, where they just like say goodbye. It's like, see you later.
yeah. See, I know. I'll tell you what I was more disappointed in was the even much, rather much more brief Felix presence. I mean, I feel like
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
I love
wanted,
Jeffrey Wright. He's fun, and he's been fun throughout this series.
Yeah. So
it wasn't a shock that they sent him out, though. It's like they're obviously going to off some people here.
Well, sure, and he's black, so he's already living on borrowed time in the cinema universe. So I mean, it's to survive multiple installments
through 4 movies. So that's pretty good.
That hurt him.
As the American like sidekick in a James Bond series. So that's pretty good.
Yeah, no,
I did like some of the back and forth with our known 007 James Bond and the new 007, where they had their little bits and pieces.
Yes, no, I actually thought she was great. I mean, she was definitely a highlight in the film for me. But yes, to your point, the 15 minutes with the and I guess she was also an American. I can't pronounce her name. Spanish.
Ana de Armas, or she was a Cuban, like working for the CIA. I don't know what. Exactly.
Yeah. But no, that was enjoyable. But yes, I thought it would be longer as well. But in any event, people you're gonna see it. You may as well go see it. It was fine. But
if you like James Bond, I'm not gonna tell people don't see this one.
No.
I would just say you don't have, unless you want to like see it on the big screen for like mostly that opening sequence. After that, I'm not sure actually how much you even need the big screen for this one. But
yeah, that's probably fair. Okay, anything else on James Bond?
Do you have anyone you're kind of rooting for to be the new James Bond? Because I was an Idris person for like 10 years, but now I'm like, he's in his 50s already. Like, I don't think that's, unless he's doing like a 1 or 2 off and then they like go again. That doesn't seem like a long term.
Let me voice something controversial. I mean, what would be do we even need another one? That would be my. I
don't know that we need it, but we're gonna get
it. What do we be served by it? I mean, I would say, I don't know that I'm looking forward to James Bond as much as I used to. I would say that the Daniel Craig kind of perspective on it, to me, left me with kind of, it's like, yeah, I think they can walk away from this one now. What I would be more interested in is maybe something in the Bond universe, but not James Bond. Like, why, I don't remember her name, the black actress, the new 007, as it were. But,
right. Why not just continue on with this team? And now she's kind of like more front and center. So that's Lashana Lynch playing Nomi.
Yeah, that would be my vote, is to have her kind of.
I would be perfectly happy with that, because I do really like the cast they built around.
Yeah, I also really I enjoy Mallory's character. I enjoy Moneypenny's character. So I mean, there's definitely a lot of power in the team they have right now, and I would say, I mean, they kind of already set that up like verbatim. Like, I'm 007.
That is the one thing I've been wondering, is like you got all these like good actors in this situation, and you can't just throw in another James Bond with these people, because I think that would undercut like what this movie does. It can just be like, oh, there's a new James Bond, we'll pretend Daniel Craig didn't exist. So it feels like you're either completely starting over, or like you said, you just kind of continue on with this group, but without the actual James Bond. It just goes 007 now.
Yeah, that would be my vote. If you're to continue,
I agree with that. I would enjoy that. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention too is, if I was doing recommendations for other films outside of the Bond canon.
Sure.
Mission Impossible, the last, I'm blanking on the name of the last one, but Fallout. Yeah, Mission Impossible Fallout, which really kind of does the same thing as this movie, but better.
Way better.
Where it's like,
way better.
It's very much a continuation, especially of the previous Mission Impossible, which again, it helps that the previous Mission Impossible had already been really good versus, again, Spectre. But like, that movie really ties in kind of like the entire Mission Impossible franchise into like by the end you're like, how did they tie like everything into this movie?
So
and it also just works as its own movie.
yeah,
like it completely, it's probably the best Mission Impossible. Honestly, I think I would probably take that, maybe Casino Royale, Skyfall are in there, but like that might be my favorite of Bourne, Bond, or Mission Impossible is Fallout, because that one's just a blast.
yeah, Fallout in like the last 10 seconds. I mean, if there's ever an edge of your seat moment, yeah, that movie was so good. We should have a whole other episode on Fallout.
There's so many sequences in that movie where like, again, this Bond, I liked the action, but I'm not like, oh yeah, that sequence. Like if this comes on cable in a year or HBO, I'm not gonna be like, oh, like I gotta watch this scene. Where like if Fallout came on and I still had cable, alas, but if that came on, there's like, oh, here's the parachuting scene, gotta watch it. They're gonna fight in the bathroom, gotta watch it.
Yeah.
Like the end, yeah. Like there's so many different parts where you're just sucked in.
Fallout was so good. I love that movie. Tom Cruise, obviously batshit crazy, but I mean, god damn, that is a good movie. I mean, that is such a good movie. If you haven't seen Fallout, go see Fallout.
Yeah, go see Fallout.
Definitely. Yeah, if you like
Fallout, check them all out.
Yeah, Fallout is the reason why. If you have cable, it's like, why were you late to your kid's sporting event? Oh, Fallout was on TV. It's like, oh, why were you late to picking me up from there? Oh, Fallout was on. I had to watch it. Yeah, that's gonna be Fallout. No one's like, oh, sorry, I'm late. I was watching No Time to Die. Like, no, you're lying. What were you really doing? I was watching Fallout. Yeah, okay. So
it's always Fallout.
It's always Fallout. Yeah, Fallout was a good fucking movie. Okay, good, Joe. I'm glad that we had you on for that. Yeah, go ahead and see it. Like I said, not a great movie, not a great Bond movie, but it was alright. Go ahead and see it. Okay, anything else on Bond?
No, I think I'm good on Bond.
Okay. Well, I kind of set this up last time you were here. Violence in film, of course, nice going from James Bond to this. Of course, Bond is a weapon, basically, of MI6. Although sometimes he doesn't pull the trigger, as he reminds us in Skyfall, but usually he does. Almost always he's going to shoot somebody.
He's got a license to kill, so.
Yeah, right. Okay, let's.
Oh, actually, that does remind me about the one thing I wanted to bring up is just how hilarious it was when the one, like, I don't know, Russian defector scientist guy just decides to threaten Nomi with like racial genocide.
Right.
And so she just kicks him to a vat of like acid water.
But like, why would he?
Why would you do that? That's the stupidest thing you could do.
He had nothing to gain from that.
And he's not like posing any immediate threat.
No.
And she just murders him, and you're like, yeah, that's fair though, because he just threatened genocide.
Yeah, the whole fucking And like, what was he gonna accomplish with that? Like, nothing.
The stupidest thing. And I also loved M not considering the possibility that when you make a nanobots that can target people genetically, that it's just really a genocide tool.
Yeah.
Like, it's exclusively bad idea.
Yeah. Right. And I mean, he died, and I didn't shed a tear over his death. Yes, violence in movies. Okay, this is something I wanted to talk about. I kind of teased it up last week with you, Joe. We were talking about, I thought it was a fun question. I don't know, maybe other people thought it was kind of boring. I thought it was a fun question. A favorite movie, a favorite film, could be a TV series where violence is not used to resolve the plot. I gave my answers as Castaway and Apollo 13, Tom Hanks for life, and Tom Cruise as well.
All in on the Toms.
Yeah, and you gave me your favorite answer as Step Up to the Streets. No,
violent dancing is violence, so that doesn't count.
Yeah, well, that's kind of like Footloose, but no. Anyways, did you want to change your answer from last week?
No, I would say, I'm still Almost Famous, Lady Bird, and then if we're removing the coming of age ones, then it would probably be like The Social Network.
Yes. I think I told you I watched Lady Bird recently and I rather enjoyed it. That was a good movie. Yes, yes. Coming of age is a good genre for this. Social Network. Yeah,
I know we're gonna have a conversation about that at some point. Clearly.
I'm gonna yeah. Okay. Here's why I wanted to bring this up.
Yeah.
We're coming into the Halloween season. A couple weeks. Obviously, people will be watching horror movies, kind of horror films.
Yeah.
I think people would agree one of the best parts of horror movies, and in particular the kind of monster type movie, whether it be werewolves, zombies, vampires, whatever it is that you are introduced to a villain where basically there is a guilt-free murder of a bad guy. Nobody feels bad about killing zombies. Nobody feels bad about killing Jaws. Nobody feels bad about killing, whatever the monster is or whatever.
Right. Or even if it's another person, like if it's the Scream movies, like you get to the end and when Sidney headshots one of the murderers, you're not like, oh man, I kind of like that guy. You're like, well, no, he's a psychotic murderer.
Yes. Yeah. Right. That's kind of part of the thrill of it. And so I thought today would be a fun thing to discuss this mindless murder in movies and guilt-free murder in movies of a couple of varieties. The first is the mindless killing of the masses. Think Avengers, think Justice League, where you have good guys and the bad guys are these kind of indistinguishable mounds of people, no personality, no whatever. They're just kind of obliterated by the good guys, and they're almost like a set piece.
Yeah.
I wish I could remember the person who did it. Let me say this, and I'll turn it over to you. I remember there was actually a good review of this. I think it was in Vox, and they were talking in context of the latest Star Wars trilogy, where they actually began the new trilogy with Flynn, who was a stormtrooper, but who has a moment of crisis, rediscovers his humanity or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And becomes a good guy. And then later on in that exact same movie, you go back to the kind of mindless masses stereotype of the stormtroopers that are just blown away by the by the rebel forces. So let me open that up, kind of get your take on that, and then I have a couple of other movies I want to go through where that kind of the mindless masses and guilt-free murder comes into play with some movies that I watched earlier this week.
Well, yeah, I think when you bring that up, like I think back to the first Avengers movie, where it's not even clear if those things are they more robots than they are aliens, because it feels like at the very end when Tony sends the nuke up into space and it blows up, that everything that invaded just kind of collapses at once, which like gives you the idea that like, oh, these aren't even like sentient beings. Right. So that's kind of like an easy out where it's like they can destroy all these things, but it's like, oh, they're not even alive. But I mean, yeah, you're right. We do often see this kind of like mass death, where stormtroopers are a very good example, where they've spent like 9 movies now just getting wrecked.
Completely wrecked. That was actually one of the funnier scenes in Clerks when they're I think it was Clerks 2, where they're talking about the Death Star being blown up. And he's like, there were probably like a lot of contractors that were just working construction jobs and they got blown to pieces.
No, that's true. And then I guess what Lucas even tries to kind of like give the out a little bit, just like, oh, they're all clones. Which
right, but why is a clone not a person? I mean,
right, which then becomes a whole nother situation where you have to dive down. But yeah, I think even clones, it kind of like lessens your like relating to them as like living beings, because we all obviously view ourselves as like, oh, we're unique, whereas a clone, they're all the same. Of course, as soon as they start living, then they have different experiences and they would actually become unique. But that's
right,
we're going down the rabbit hole there eventually. But
they're all in possession of a mind,
right?
And they're all people. Let me set you up with another movie that I thought I rewatched this week, and that was Age of Ultron.
Age of Ultron, yeah. I think is a much more interesting movie than people give it credit for.
Oh, I think for multiple. Well, that one and Civil War, I thought were the 2 most interesting, kind of the Avenger I mean, I guess that one would be Captain America, but it kind of felt
But yeah,
Avengers.
because yeah, by the time you get down to like Endgame and stuff, and people are like, "Oh, I think Thanos was the point." It's like, so you're just like pro genocide, like.
Oh, well,
It's
that
not a
was always
point.
bizarre to me. Yeah, no,
Yeah, it's like
the
he has
whole
unlimited power and he just decides mass genocide. It's like I feel like there are other options. Like you only have to think for 2 seconds there. Like
yeah.
it's
I
not
actually
complicated.
no.
Whereas like with
There was this
Ultron, you
whole
have a whole thing too, where like it's about Tony like wanting to build his
yeah.
shield around the Earth. And so even if you don't have to buy into anything going on with Ultron, you can just look at like the way Cap versus Tony feels about things in this in Civil War, where it's kind of like you can kind of see why each guy is motivated the way that he is.
Yeah, well, and Captain America's kind of insistence on no checks and balances, that he basically is going to trust his own moral judgment to wield the power of the Avengers is the very
Which feels
antithesis
right,
of
which
America.
sounds kind of right. It sounds insane, but at the same time, he's also all about like personal accountability, where on some level, Tony's trying to take away his own accountability because he doesn't feel
True,
up to it.
true, and give that. Yes, no, that's true. To Ultron in particular, though. So people who remember the film, basically Ultron creates a variety of robots that he inhabits, kind of his mind is spread throughout the robots. And for reasons that make sense within the film universe, basically they have to kill every robot to kill Ultron. Okay, so that's the
because
premise.
they're all interconnected. As long as one is alive, then his consciousness exists.
Yeah. Now here's my problem with that. The very last scene of the movie, or maybe second to last, but near the end, Vision is talking with the last instantiation of Ultron, the last robot form of Ultron left. Vision's talking to him. Ultron is giving his reasons for hating humanity or whatever it is, and Vision's calmly listening to him and arguing back and forth. And in this moment, I think a very telling thing happens. Vision and Ultron are having a debate. They're having a debate. Now, Ultron, we are led to believe, is actually an artificially intelligent robot. But as I said before on the show, putting artificial in front of intelligence doesn't really make any sense. Either you're intelligent or you're not. Either you're a person or you're not. Whether you're carbon or silicon based, it doesn't really matter very much. The point of the film is that Ultron really was a mind. He really had a mind.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
To the extent that Vision was arguing with Ultron.
Right.
And basically the last kind of second of the film, the last robot, Ultron lunges at Vision and Vision blows into pieces. Okay. Well, why couldn't Vision just kind of dismantle the weaponized parts of that robot, but keep the Ultron mind intact? If it made sense for Vision to have a debate with Ultron because he was in possession of a mind, then I think you can make the case that really they shouldn't have killed Ultron in the end, but they should have tried. They should have treated Ultron as you would treat any other criminal, which is to give them some kind of chance of rehabilitation. They could have done that with Ultron. They could have just kind of taken away his guns, basically, and just kind of put him in prison or something like that. But instead, they decided to kind of blow him to pieces. And I thought, it was basically, and again, you could argue it was self-defense because Vision was lunged at and all that other kind of stuff. But I think at the end, it was just kind of, even though Ultron in the movie had a mind, the audience doesn't, at least I don't think the audience, I didn't feel when I first saw it, we don't really feel like a person is dying when the last Ultron robot dies. It's kind of this evil menacing force that dies, but not really a person. And I think that lost some weight for me on the second watch, where I thought, they shouldn't have killed him in the end. They should have tried to keep him alive and change his mind through the process of debate.
I guess, I mean, obviously from a practical standpoint, they just didn't have a plan for more Ultron. So that's why he died.
Right.
From trying to defend it as a actual choice within the movie that Vision makes, I guess I would just argue that, like, Vision has part of Ultron inside of him. And so I think he's very aware of what Ultron wants. And he kind of I think he would probably have a better understanding of, like, this guy's just a one-track mind at this point,
Hmm.
and there's not good. Like I can debate his
Beyond
humor.
Redemption, Joe, is that your
Yeah,
argument that some people
I
can be
think.
beyond redemption? Oh my God. Horrible.
I mean, it's dark, but I think that would be the defense, is that Vision knows, as being part of Ultron on some level, that this guy's not going to change.
Oh, wow. Wow. So,
That's why he's just got to end it.
man, some people can't change and therefore we just have to kill them. That sounds pretty dark, Joe. That sounds pretty dark. Well, I was thinking, really the reason that movies have to use these kind of mindless things to be killed is because, of course, in a movie, you're not going to have time to develop 200 characters or something like that.
Right.
You maybe can develop 4. And as you learn in James Bond, even that can be a little bit challenging, developing your character. So, I understand it, but I've never been one to really worry about, violent video games or things like that. And I'm still not, but I do think it's interesting, the link between violence and excitement, and how, big battle scenes are exciting when really, if we think about it, even in the context of the movie, what we're watching is a lot of people die. That's
Right.
ultimately what we're faced with as an audience, that we're watching a lot of people die, and it's kind of being reduced to an excitement. I think that's kind of interesting.
Which, yeah, I mean, that falls into one of the big debates about my favorite film, Saving Private Ryan.
Yes.
Where there's this argument about, is it an anti-war film? Is it a pro-war film? Can any war film be anti-war? And a large part of that just goes to the D-Day sequence, which is obviously the main thing that people remember from Saving Private Ryan, because it was so visceral. Again, like a ton of veterans who went to see it like had to leave or even be sedated because it was just triggering to them.
Mm-hmm.
But for those of us who obviously had not seen combat,
right,
there is a visceral thrill to watching that. I mean, like, put in that situation where I don't have to fear for my own life.
Right.
Because obviously, if you're in that real situation, I'm sure your adrenaline goes off like crazy.
Sure.
But it's right. But it's terrifying. Whereas we're removed enough where we're only getting that excitement. And then, yeah, like, is that actually a good thing? That, like, when you view it from that, so I think obviously, like you mentioned, like the violence with film, where there's all this, there's mostly, I think it was like in the 90s where it became this big thing about like, oh, violence in film and violence in video games is going to cause all these issues. And of course, like for 20 straight years, the violent crime rate has been going down. So it's pretty clear there's not a link there.
No.
But I do think, but part of that is because there's a remove.
Right.
Like, I don't watch John Wick and go like, man, I should really go out and start like headshotting Eastern European gangsters. Like, that's just not, for a multitude of reasons, it's not something that's going to happen. But I do think some people have made the argument that like Saving Private Ryan kind of built up this attitude of like dying for your country is this really noble thing.
Right.
And that kind of helped lead us into the post 9/11 world, where obviously for at least a few years, most of the country was behind like a number of wars. And I also think, now this is going a little off tangent, but I know we don't have to get into the particulars of this because it could take up its own podcast. But obviously with the whole Dave Chappelle thing going on right now, there's a lot of questions about, does entertainment change our attitudes? And the CEO of Netflix, Ted Sarandos, was like, no, it doesn't. That's why this is fine. Keeping in mind that when they came out with 13 Reasons Why and then faced a ton of backlash, they put trigger warnings on the show. And actually one study found that the month after that first debuted, suicide rates among boys 10 to 17 hit a 5-year high. So again, I think when we look at any form of violence, whether it's self-harm, or we're watching violence, I think it's, can this apply to my life? And then I think that can ultimately shape us to a degree.
I think those are all fine points. I did not know the latest Dave Chappelle milieu going on right now. I know that he had a new special and I haven't seen it. I certainly appreciate, yes, you extending the violence conversation to include self-harm, which of course undoubtedly is appropriate. Yes, the simple link that people tried to make in the 90s between violent video games and kind
Right.
of this
That is
brainwashing
like
was obviously
exactly. It was
silly. Yeah,
nonsense. Yeah.
no, that was complete nonsense and stupid, and I think people don't take that too seriously. I would say my bigger my and I don't even know that I would call it a concern. It's what is when we see a movie when people are faced with problems that
Right.
we see violence as the tool to
Right.
solve
The
it.
solution to the problem. Yeah.
Yes. There was, and I wish I could remember, and actually spent some time this afternoon trying to find it, but I couldn't find it. But there's this really clever rap lyric where it's something I don't have it quite right, but it's something to the extent of it isn't a plot without a conflict. And I thought that
Yeah.
was something that I remember hearing when I was younger, and has kind of stood with me. Is that even the way that we frame storytelling is with tension. That a story is about something being conquered, something being dealt with.
Right. Like
And
at any time, if you read any like screenwriting book, they're like first 10 pages, you introduce the conflict of the story.
you're right. And so everything is framed in terms of conflict, which is already kind of interesting because I would say I don't think the average person thinks of their day as a kind of conflict. I mean, there's things to be done, but I don't know that I would say that that's a conflict. So to make that the normative version of storytelling is already kind of aggressive. It's already like, here's a story and it's going to involve a problem.
Right.
Okay. Then, at least it seems to me most commonly, that problem is dealt with through some form of violence. And so to me, it isn't so much a matter of brainwashing, which I agree with you was complete nonsense. That was kind of this weird rebuttal to, you kind of saw the same thing with like people saying dumb things about rap music, that it was kind of all the same BS basically, that was causing problems.
But like again, I do think it can shape certain like I think entertainment can shape certain attitudes. Like if you look at like gay rights, where you look at like how it's portrayed increasingly in a positive light in the 90s and 2000s, and then you get to like where Modern Family happens and it's like the biggest show in the country, and then like 5 years later gay marriage is legal.
Yes.
I mean, granted that was a court decision, but most people supported that decision. So I think we should obviously be careful about saying like you can't affect anything at all. But
no, right. Well,
but again, like most violence that we see depicted, especially obviously superheroes, it doesn't apply to us in any way. So it's not really going to affect how we view things.
No.
Whereas like I do think if you go back and you look at like Dirty Harry type stuff,
right,
like the renegade cop who like doesn't have time for red tape, and then you look at how many shootings we have with police officers, and even if you just take race out of the discussion, the number of like white people who get shot by police is an enormous amount. That seems wild compared to every other country. And there are obviously other factors. There's gun rights here, blah, blah, blah. But I do think if you looked at that and you saw for 20, 30 years, people were watching these movies where like the cop is always the good guy. The ends justify the means. I think that creates a mindset. Whereas if you're in the 90s and you're a kid and you're playing Duke Nukem, you're not suddenly like going to go around fighting people everywhere.
Yes. No, I think, I mean, all of that is well said. I mean, I remember making that point about, and this is an old Adam Carolla joke, but, the idea of, every week there's a new TV show where the cop plays by his own rules. And it's like, it just becomes kind of stupid at some point. I remember there's a new cop show out right now. And one of the taglines, the guy was like, I ain't no politician. And I made a joke to my wife. I'm like, so he's not accountable for his behavior? Like, I mean, what does that fucking mean? Like, he doesn't have constituents that can,
when your union is strong enough, Jimmy, when your union is strong enough, no one's going to hold you accountable.
Yeah. The whole thing is silly. So saying all that, what's the reason for it? I think framing things in terms of conflict, in terms of winners and losers is just bad in general. I mean,
I think I could somewhat defend the conflict thing just because I do think it is interesting that is the dominant wording when we talk about this.
And again,
I think that's a
all
good
credit
point.
to the rap song that I can't, remember. I really am trying to. I googled it today, I couldn't find it, but it was a very clever lyric and one that's
that is good. I mean, obviously now conflict can mean anything within your script. It could,
Sure.
romantic comedies have conflict.
Yeah.
But like you said, I think the wording is interesting there. I do think winners and losers is a deeper problem, just societally, where there's often, if you look at like any form of, whether you're looking at politics, where you're looking at storytelling, where there is this kind of zero-sum game idea, which obviously, hey, like if you've been watching Netflix recently, Squid Game very much plays into
I haven't
that
seen
question.
yet, and I have to watch it too. Yeah,
very much plays into the idea of like the dangers of viewing life as a zero-sum game. That's actually one of the reasons why I love Arrival as a movie, is that very directly is pushing back on the idea of the world as a zero-sum game, or the universe, I guess.
And very literally, which is I'm always fine with. I don't mind something being on the nose as long as it's a good point. And so in that movie Arrival is actually an excellent example of a movie where not only is conflict not used to solve the plot, but when conflict is attempted to be used, it horribly backfires.
Yes.
So it's actually a perfect movie for the things I want to talk about, because not only does it explain why violence is not, in general, a good approach, but also shows that when used, it can have disastrous consequences. Arrival was actually a great movie, and the idea of using language to resolve conflict is, what the cornerstone of civilization. I mean, is that basically what everything comes down to? Is that, and back to my point about Ultron, not having to blow him up to pieces at the end, even though Joe thinks that he's beyond salvation. No, Arrival is actually a perfect movie, and actually just a great movie in general. I know that you like it, I do as well. But actually a perfect example of a movie where conflict is not used to resolve the main premise, the main story point. It's a wonderful movie. I recommend that people see Arrival if you haven't seen it. One of the few movies that actually I bought on YouTube. I own that one. I own Endgame.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, all in all, good choices. But yes, I thought, framing. So why violence? As I kind of mentioned to people last week, I began reading on the origins of totalitarianism by a well-known writer, Hannah Arendt. Probably not saying her name right. Don't want to start discussing that book quite yet, but I am reading it. I am enjoying it. But more and more, and you mentioned politics. I despise talking about politics on this podcast. I go to great lengths to avoid it.
We don't have to dive into the politics.
My charming co-host does not always share my reluctance to discuss politics. No, but basically, I think everything more or less I frame things that I care the most about in terms of politics is this very real concern that violence is always on the horizon. That's my fear, that there's always this potential for violence, and I think it's almost as if we kind of have a Voldemort mentality where it's like we just don't talk about, but it's just so keenly, I think, real that violence is always a possible outcome for conflict, and that therefore it's one that we should just take seriously and always commit ourselves to, like, saying, hey, we're not going to fight over this to the greatest degree possible. In that, to the point about movies impacting us, I think it would be a nice thing to see more movies where violence is not used as a tool. Not because, again, I'm not worried about people being influenced to go out and turn into John Wick. That is a far-fetched idea. But even just to introduce in their idea that there are other tools in the tool belt, so to speak. That to me would be enough.
Yeah, another movie that, ultimately violence does end up kind of solving some of the issues in the movie.
Yeah, Space Jam. No.
Space Jam 2, my favorite movie. No, is the second Planet of the Apes movie, which is very much about trying to avoid violence and then having other people kind of like, or apes, other living beings, like having been harmed enough where they feel like violence has to be the answer in the the situations that creates, which ultimately, again, violence does end up being part of the short-term solution in that movie, but it creates a longer-term problem, which I think is one of the beauties of that franchise in its entirety, which really is about, like, these apes and the humans don't have to kill each other.
Right. Right.
But through circumstance and through other people not realizing that, you end up in a situation where violence ends up being inevitable. Well, I guess the point is the violence wasn't inevitable, but
right. But it became by ignoring it.
Yeah.
Let me set you up. I know you're a busy guy, Joe. We're gonna wrap up soon. Let me end with an idea that I was tossing around in my head today, and you let me know if you agree with it or not.
All right.
And we'll kind of close on this point. I was thinking about an interpretation of optimism. So as you know, Joe and I spent a fair amount of time talking about David Deutsch's book, The Beginning of Infinity, where he essentially defines optimism as problems being solvable, that problems are inevitable, but that problems are solvable. And I think an interpretation of that is that the enemy of violence is time. That if we can just buy time, we can solve conflict without violence. That violence is kind of this thing people go to out of desperation. That would be an interpretation, I guess, of optimism, that violence can be defeated with time. It has to be with human effort. I'm not a believer in the moral arc of the universe. I think that's kind of a stupid thing to say, but I think coupled with human effort, if we just have time, violence can be avoided. Do you agree?
I think that's generally true, but I mean, as with anything, I wouldn't take it to the absolute, just because, I mean, this is kind of the go-to example for, like,
right. Go ahead. Bring up the Holocaust. Here it comes.
Oh no, well, I mean, it's linked to the Holocaust, which is Israel and Palestine.
Oh, sure.
Because if you're arguing about land, then you end up with kind of a situation where on some level it is zero sum. Like,
right.
If someone takes your home and they're living in your home now, the only solution for you is to get your home back. So in that situation, obviously, that's why I think empathy, obviously, you kind of need this link of being able to empathize with someone and realizing that, I mean, I think just it's realizing that you're not special to a degree, or you're not more special than anyone else. It's like we all have the same inherent value. Just because, just because you're American or you're Israeli or you're Palestinian or whatever, you don't have then more inherent value than someone else. Now, I'm not saying governments should necessarily view the world that way, because unless everyone did, it's not going to work. But I think just on an individual level, remembering that, I think that's a very helpful way to avoid violence, is just seeing my own wants do not automatically trump someone else's. And so even if you're in a situation where just effort and time doesn't solve that problem, having that in the back of your mind, that I'm not more important than the person next to me, is another way. But I do generally agree, though. I think when you look at things like world hunger, I'm an optimist in that. I think we can solve that. Now, we're not going to solve it if everyone decides to be organic, but that's a whole nother discussion.
Yes, actually, no, you are correct. Yeah, we can make fun of organic, etc. on another time. Probably one of the few things you and I agree on. No, actually, you and I probably agree on quite a bit. The point you make about inherent value is, of course, not only a true point, but an important point, and an idea that was hard fought. And we should take more time to remember it. I certainly agree with you on that. Again, we come back to the problem of zero sum and the challenge of zero sum conflict. That when we frame worth in terms of things that are zero sum, the inevitability of conflict is that somebody will lose, and that in general people don't want to. So so no, I agree with you there as well. That's kind of my case for growth, is kind of the gradual erosion of zero sum thinking. And with it, a bunch of other things as well. The kind of, fallback of different categories of people, I think oftentimes, or zero sum, race or class or something, is framing another person's gain as your loss is by definition zero sum.
Yeah.
And of course is responsible either entirely or partly for all sorts of atrocities the world over. So that was all that I had for today. I mean, we began with
I think we did a lot
on world hunger. No, that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that. Joe, tell people where they can find you if they want to hear more of your take on things. You're on a few platforms, actually. Where can people find you?
Yeah, if you're into football or fantasy football, go to the IB network on Spotify or Apple, wherever. It's a podcast group. I do the daily fantasy and the weekly football recaps on those. Twitter, which honestly, you're probably mostly just going to get me retweeting progressive politics takes. But if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at Joe E Matz. So that's Joe with 2 E's, Matz, M-A-T-Z.
This is the Joe with 2 E's, the other Joe with 4 underscores in between the Jose and the Cuervo. Yeah, definitely check out Joe Matz. Like I said, him and I, friends for a long time. More and more, I find myself agreeing with things he says. Just don't let him know I said so. And if you enjoyed this episode, check us out on Twitter as well at roses_rhetoric. We're also on Instagram. I also follow the charming co-host Goes to Stanford at Jose4_Cuervo. Until next time, I am Jimmy Hackett signing off for Joseph Matz and Joseph Stanford, saying ciao.